Hi friend, I'm so glad that you're here for this chat with Ash. You're invited to join me in striving to better know and love God, walk in light of being known and loved by Him, and to make Him known as we share our stories. Some of ours are harder to share than others, but there's hope and beauty in every story because of the author who is doing a great work in and around us every day. Hi friends, welcome back to this Chats with Ash. I hope that you are just as excited as I am about the theme that God has given me for season 3, which has been come to the table. As somebody that really hates the kitchen and cooking, I love this idea that we see in Scripture that God's word is for us to eat and that God prepares the table before us. Our job is to come to it in a posture ready to receive whatever it is that He's asking us to consume. And it's been a really big challenge for me because, as we've discussed in other episodes, not everything on the table always looks appetizing. So we have to trust that the one that has prepared it knows that it's something that's necessary and good for us to grow and thrive and become more like Him. In the last episode, I talked about sharing our stories and if there's ever a time for silence, and then if we are to speak, what does that look like if we're practicing wisdom and discretion? If you haven't listened to it, I would encourage you to do that. Also, just a little plug here, if you would invite others to the table by liking and sharing these episodes. Also on YouTube, you can subscribe to my channel and stay up to date with content that was being put out. But in the last episode, as I talked about sharing our stories, I filmed it knowing that it would mean a continuation of what I'm striving to do in this space, and that's sharing my story with you. And hopefully what you're seeing is that my story and yours really isn't about me or you at all. It's all about the author of our stories, the one that makes all the difference. And today we're going to talk about a topic that can be challenging for many of us. It's challenging for me. This is a part of my story that I am not used to sharing because it is relatively new to me. So today we're talking about depression. And actually, we're going to talk about it this week and next. I'm going to have a guest on next week talking to us about his experience with depression and just the importance of us sharing about it. But I really wanted to start that conversation on a very personal note. I don't want to ever make you feel like I'm challenging you to share your stories and make much of God in doing that, but not living that out personally. And as I've said before, there are parts of our stories that are just between us and God, and that's okay, or it's just between us and a few trusted friends. But this is a part of my story that I know God is asking me to share. And my hope in doing that is that you get to see a bigger picture of God in it. But I also hope that for those of you that may also struggle, that you find a safe space here, that you find encouragement here and comfort. And for those of you that are like, well, I've never struggled with that, would you consider sitting down at this table today and just listening with a heart that's willing to learn and consider what's being put out there? I'm not really sure exactly where to start because it is hard for me to even say I have been struggling with depression. It's hard for me to use that word because I feel like I need to have some sort of official diagnosis. And I think part of that is because I had preconceived ideas about what depression is and what depression looks like. And my experience has challenged that. So I don't know if you've ever seen this online, but sometimes you'll see online, people will post a picture and it might be like somebody that's smiling and looks really happy. And then the caption will read, "This is what depression looks like." There is accuracy there. I am somebody that usually has a smile on my face, and I'm not smiling to be insincere. I like to smile. But just because I'm smiling doesn't mean that there isn't pain, doesn't mean that there are not things that I'm struggling with. And so I'm learning that it's really important for us to ask each other, how are you doing for real? Again, not trying to be fake by smiling, but a smile isn't necessarily the best indicator of how somebody is doing. I started struggling with this. I don't even know if I could put a timeline on it, because I think that for a long time I was just unaware. I wasn't really able to articulate how I was struggling, what I was feeling, and I was certainly not able to identify it. I like to write, as you may know, and I keep a personal journal. I often joke and call it my depths of despair journal, because sometimes when I'm in a low place or when the sky just seems a little bit more gray, it's as if the words flow out a little bit better. I think it's just a way that I process what I'm thinking and feeling and experiencing. And in season 2, I shared a little bit about writing in that journal, and about how, as I read the words that I'd been writing for several months on a very good day, I came to understand that what I had actually been talking about was suicidal thoughts. And I had gone as far as to even outline a plan of how I would do that. And, you don't go through life being fine and then suddenly reach a point of having suicidal thoughts and creating a plan. It's like a progression of steps. And for me, depression has definitely been linked in that process. And there's this line by Taylor Swift. I am a total Swiftie, which I was not always. My brother and sister worked on me for years, and I was like, absolutely not. But as a writer, when she came out with her album Folklore, I listened to it to appease my siblings, and I was just so captivated by her ability to say so much with so little. And there is a line in one of her songs that says, "I might be okay, but I'm not fine at all." And when I read that, I understood what she was trying to express, because for so long, I've been there. I might be okay, but I'm not fine at all. And it was hard for me to admit that to myself, but even more difficult to start talking about that and admitting that to others. I think part of the reason is depression isn't something that, at least within my circles of believers as I've grown up and as an adult, it isn't really something that seems to be talked about very much or addressed very much. And we're going to talk about this in the next episode, but I really believe that is something that needs to change, and I want to be a part of that change. But I think I had it in my head, this idea that to struggle with depression must mean that I am a bad Christian. Like, it has to be that there is some sin in my life, and therefore I'm a bad Christian. It's interesting because in Mark 12, we're told to love God with all of our heart, our soul, and our mind. So there are different facets of how God is and who God has created us to be. We are mind, soul, and heart. So when talking about something like depression, I think it's really important to keep that in mind, because yes, if we're not doing things God's way, if we are walking in a sin pattern and practicing things that go against God, then it is very likely we're going to find ourselves facing a form of depression, because things aren't right between us and God, and things like we're not doing life the way God intended. And so that is something I've experienced. I've had sin in my life that was not dealt with and definitely contributed. However, there is more to us than just the soul, than just the spiritual. We have our mind. What is my mind resting on? What am I thinking about? What am I sitting on? And there's also the physical being. God has created our bodies to be physical. It fascinates me when believers kind of brush that off, because, if I am dealing with a physical illness, like, I don't know, pneumonia, and I go to the doctor and I get treated for that physical ailment, a result of living in a fallen world, that is normal, that is accepted. But I think we also need to examine how the physical can affect the other aspects of who we are, how that can tie into, like, if I am struggling with pneumonia, I might struggle to breathe well. If I'm physically, if something's off with inside me, it may affect how I feel emotionally as well. I am not a professional in this, so bear with me because there are other people much more qualified to dive into that topic. But my whole point in that is I want to share this part of my story with you because yes, there were things spiritually within inside of me that needed dealt with. But also during that season of my life, I was not doing well physically. And I went to a doctor and I went to try to get some answers. And after some testing, she called me back and one of the first things she asked me was, "Are you struggling with depression?" And I said, it was the first time I'd said it, "Yes." And she said, "Well, no wonder, because these levels that came back on your test are way too high and these levels over here are way too low." And so she knew just from looking at the stats, this patient of mine is probably struggling with depression. So I say that just to point out it's so important when we're struggling with depression to seek help. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but we need to seek help from multiple people. Go to a doctor, go to a counselor, go to your pastor. Make sure that you're covering all the bases. I mentioned feeling like, well, if I am struggling with depression, I must be a really bad Christian. But I'm challenged by that idea because when I read my Bible, I see multiple examples of heroes of the faith that also experienced depression, darkness, wilderness places, whatever it is that you want to call it. And I want to point some of these out to you because this just encourages me. One of my favorite biblical heroes is David. He was such an imperfect man. He committed some very serious sins in his life and experienced some very dark consequences for them. But ultimately, David was called a man after God's own heart. And he went through some really hard stuff. And David, in Psalm 42:11, he wrote, "Why are you downcast, O my soul? Why so disturbed?" Elijah is another. He was fed up. And in 1 Kings 19:4, he says, "I've had enough. Take my life. I want out of here. I'm checking out." Job 10:1, "I have no peace, no quietness, no rest, only turmoil." Jeremiah in chapter 20, verse 18, "Why did if I could read my writing, basically, why was I born? To see trouble and sorrow and to end my days in shame?" That's a big question. But my favorite example of being in a place of anguish is from Jesus. In Mark 14, verses 34 through 36, he was about to face the cross and he was praying and he says, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death." I understand what those verses were describing about those experiences. I know what it is to be in a darkness so heavy that you don't think you can escape. In season 2, when I talked about struggling with suicidal thoughts, I described it as a wilderness place. And it really is like that. It's this wild, savage place that you just don't know if there's an end to it. And you don't know if you're going to make it out. You don't know if you'll ever be more than okay. But as we're at the table today, it's time to turn our focus to what God says. And the word that I want to present to you before you today is what God has given me, and that's hope. Let's put hope on the table. The thing about depression is when you're there and you're struggling with it, it just doesn't feel like there is any hope. And that is such a lie from the devil. And so when I think about hope, I think the first thing that we need to recognize is God's presence. God says, I am with you always. I love David when he wrote that God, his shepherd, leads him beside still waters, and he restores his soul. He does the same for us. Christy McLeland, who was the author of the study that I did earlier in the summer, you guys are going to keep hearing about this because the study, God just used it to make such an impact on me in just the right time. But she was talking in one of the sessions about how we often think in the West of the desert or the wilderness as something that we want to get out of. But she says the Jewish people view the desert as the place where the Lord often meets his people and speaks to them. And she talks about Moses in Exodus 3 in the desert and how God spoke to him. And she wrote, in the desert, the wilderness, God meets you and teaches you unique lessons that these dry and barren places frame in a way no other place would. In the Middle Eastern culture, the wilderness is seen almost as a sacred place, a place of intimacy where God speaks a word to you. I love that because that is so very true. Wilderness places can often seem like places of isolation, and sometimes they are, most often because we isolate ourselves. But when we call out to God, he is always near and he will answer. Christy also wrote, in the Bible, when we read that the Lord sees or hears something, those words signal to us that he is going to act. It's not as if God has missed something, as if he were a man who could turn away and miss a glimpse or a whisper of something that has happened. God is omnipresent. He sees and hears everything that happens to us. He is responsive, alive, awake, ever ready to come to the rescue, to attend to his children in guidance and love. The story of Moses isn't just a story about a burning bush. Christy wrote that the story is really about the living God who refuses to look away. Let's just stop right there. Because I think part of the reason that we isolate ourselves when we are in places like depression is the pride and the embarrassment that comes with I'm struggling. And what if I'm rejected if I reach out? Take a moment to just sit on this fact. God refuses to look away. He chooses to see, to hear, to let it matter, to let it all matter. And it's about the living God who isn't afraid to come down, get in the middle of the ruins of this world, and put his hands all over them to restore us. We run from drama, but the Lord runs into it to bring rescue, restoration, and renewal. I have read and reread those words so many times. Because when I don't feel like there is any hope, when I struggle because it doesn't seem like there's an answer, the answer is the living God who runs into the wilderness. He runs into the darkness, into the fire to rescue, restore, and bring renewal. Christy asked a really important question, one that I'm still chewing on, because she asked, how do I carry the wilderness with me? How do I remember the word the Lord taught me in the wilderness? That has been a difficult question for me to answer because, like she mentioned, my tendency, my knee-jerk reaction is to run from it. I want out. Thanks. But God has a purpose. There's always a purpose in the suffering, and he promises his purposes for his children are good. So I'm going to share some of my answers with you to that question, and I hope that it might encourage you just like I'm encouraged, but I hope it challenges you too, because it really challenges me. When I'm struggling with depression, when I'm struggling with the wilderness place, I am learning, A, to call out to God like we just talked about, but B, to rest. It's okay to rest. There are times when we need to say, I'm not fine right now, and I need to take some time to sit before the Lord, the great physician, and I need him to help me rest, to restore my soul. And what that looks like for you is something only you and God can work through. For me, it's looked like setting some boundaries. There have been some things that I've had to learn to say no to. There have been times when I'm like, I'm not going to carry that. I'm going to let this person do that instead. And that's really important. I'm a people pleaser by nature, so it's also very difficult, but I'm learning the necessity of it, and I'm also learning to be okay when I do those things if other people don't necessarily appreciate it in the moment. That's okay. Also, I was thinking about the idea that there is joy in our salvation. If God is the rescuer, then he saves us, and there's joy in that. The big picture of that is that this isn't the end. This place, this world, this is temporary. This is just the terminal that we're waiting in to get to our destination, which is heaven. So when I feel depression, when I feel that darkness and that sadness, one thing that helps me with perspective is to say, this is just a moment. It might seem like a long time. Like, I always kind of laugh when our kids, like if they're waiting for something and we say, well, it's going to be so long before it happens. And they're like, that's forever. I get it. Sometimes as I'm waiting for, like heaven, it seems like forever. But what we do in and with the waiting is so important. One thing that I'm learning to do in and with the waiting is to worship the Lord. So I love music. I love music because I love the way that music can tell a story. But I'm really trying to dive deeply into worship music because I'm learning. I've written about it on my website. It's ashleyivester.com. There's actually a post called, I think it's called Put Heart in Its Place, Worship in the Heart, something like that. I should know, I wrote it, but oh well. The point is that there is power in worship. When we are struggling, when our hearts are heavy, when our mind is overcome with the taunts and lies of the evil one, there is something really powerful I've learned about worship. Putting that music on and thinking on what is true through song. So if you're not sure where to start, I would highly recommend listening to Phil Wickham's album called Hymn of Heaven. It is a great CD album full of really powerful truths, and it's God used it so much in my life and is using it so much in my life. When I'm in those hard places, that's where I turn musically to worship. Prayer. Like, here's the thing. Christy McLeland talks about God as a living God. He is. And prayer is just a fancy word for talking to God. Think about those that you love the most. Think about those that you want to sit with. You talk to them. That's what we get to do to God. God has made it possible for us to be in relationship with him. And so when I'm in great anguish, I get to talk to God. I don't get to talk to him only if everything's put together and the smile on my face is genuine. No, I get to come to him in the tears. I get to come to him in the numbness. I get to talk to him. And sometimes there are no words, and that's okay too. We get to sit in his presence. And scripture says that the Spirit intercedes for us when we don't have words. The last thing I want to touch on that is so important when we're struggling with depression is to question your focus. It is important to look inward, to ask God to help us examine what's happening, because what's in the heart comes out. And so there is a need to do that, to look inward. But I remember when I was in a really dark place and I was talking to a friend who knew I was greatly struggling. And one day she challenged me and she said, do you think maybe you're spending too much time looking inward when maybe some of your focus needs to be on God and others? And she was right. I was putting way too much emphasis on inside. And so a great way to look outward is look for ways to love, ways to practice kindness, ways to serve others, because doing that will shift the perspective. It puts things in its place. And again, all of this comes with balance, right? Like, oh, at first I talked about the need to rest, and now I'm talking about serving. There's a time and a place for everything. So this is why we need to talk to God, ask him to be our counselor and help guide us in, for right now, for today, what is it you would have me do? Do I need to rest before you? Or are you going to give me a service opportunity and help my perspective shift a little bit? Those are things that we have to take before the Lord. And just because I don't want to neglect saying this, and I'm afraid I did at the beginning, when I talked about how we are heart, soul, and mind, make sure as you're walking through a wilderness place, as you're dealing with something like depression, that yes, first and foremost, you're seeking the Lord. But friends, he's given us people to walk alongside of us. Community is so important. So seek those who can help with all the different facets of who you are. Seek out a counselor. I'm going to share more in another episode. That's something that I've been doing. Seek out your pastor. Seek out your friends that you know won't just say, I'll pray for you, but that really will pray for you and really will follow through with hard questions like, are you okay? And seek the help of a medical doctor. Make sure there's not anything going on physically that might be contributing to the way you feel or the darkness that you're experiencing. So that's a little bit about my, I guess, ongoing experience with depression. It's been really interesting because I guess I thought it would be like a one and done kind of experience. Like, okay, well, I worked with my doctor and we dealt with the physical aspect, and okay, I've been taking the things in my life like sin that I need to deal with before the Lord, and I've been surrendering these things and trying to walk with him. And yet there are days when it seems like out of nowhere, a cloud will settle. And there have been times like Eric came home one day and he took one look at me and he said, "Are you okay?" And I am learning to answer him honestly. And I said, "No." And I was emotional. And I said, I don't even know why I feel this way. And I don't want to feel it, but I feel like I can't get out of it. And he said to me, "It's okay. I'll sit here with you." And that's what I want to end on today. That was probably the best gift he could have given me as we sit at this table together. Some of us are truly fine. Others of us are saying, I might be okay. And still others are saying, I'm not okay or fine at all. Friends, we need to start sharing those things with each other so that we can comfort and challenge and encourage one another. But sometimes maybe we just need to learn to say, I'll sit here with you. I'll sit before the living God with you. And we're going to eat that hope, and we're going to watch him run into the darkness and rescue. We'll talk more about this next week. Until then, go and grow in grace. Friend, I hope you enjoyed our time together today. Author Christy McLeland once wrote that we want to live like rivers and not lakes. We want the word to travel to us, through us, and to others, and that we've only truly learned a thing when we can give it away. If God has used this episode to challenge and encourage you, would you consider inviting others to the table by liking and sharing this episode? It's my prayer that we will grow in boldness as we share our stories and reveal the author and how he has made all the difference.